Honestly, I'm not even supposed to be laughing because this is actually not funny, right? And let me just drop my phone. So, Asian people, they are craving for black people's business, right? They are craving for black people's cooperation. And I feel like reason is because since black people, black Americans specifically, started boycotting a lot of Asian business, Latinos business, Hispanics business, and so on and so forth, they have not been flourishing the way they used to. Do you get? You know, a lot of them made mouth and they are like, yeah, even if you did not come, we'll have other people coming to us. But now they are coming to that realization that they literally need black Americans. So an Asian woman actually brought out a question that popped out a lot of curiosity, where she was literally asking, where was Asian people during the Jim Crow segregation, blah, blah, blah. But trust black Americans, they gave her the exact answers that she literally deserved. I actually want you guys to watch this video. Welcome to the channel. My name is Sonia. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. And credits belongs to the original creators of every single clips and stitches we have in our today's episode. Please, this is just for educational purposes, not to come here ruffle on anyone's shoulder or to make anyone feel uncomfortable. And yes, with that being said, let's dive right into this video and I'll be back with commentaries. Make sure you watch to the end so that you can drop me your honest opinion, right? So let's go watch, guys.
This is me sending love to the black community because we love you. We love your support. Sending you flowers. Anyways, listen to black people because they've been right since day one. Just saying.
Found a gap in history and I'm trying to understand, where were the Asian and Hispanic kids during the segregation era? Like when it was whites only and coloreds only and the black people were integrating into...
This creator comes up with an amazing point about the lack of history about segregation during the Jim Crow era of Hispanic and Latinx children. And I mean, the most we pretty much know about the desegregation cases is the Brown versus Board of Education. Nobody necessarily talked Asimilas versus Westheimer. I believe that's how you pronounce that. But that was in California. In Texas specifically, there was a few court cases that went up, but the majority of that was just, what we're going to do, we're going to desegregate our schools. We're going to give Hispanics and Spanish people whiteness so we can desegregate our schools, and they still can't go to white schools, but the black kids can go there and they're considered white. A lot of school districts did that. To this day, that's why you have race, Caucasian, ethnicity, Hispanic, non-Hispanic, or other. Like, that is a thing because of Jim Crow. Honestly, it's traced back. That's how you can get skewed police statistics and everything else. And so in Texas, there was signs that was like whites only, no Spanish and Mexicans. Like, that was their race up until Jim Crow era, where those lines got a little bit blurred because of lining school districts for integration. So the Blackwell School here in I think is Marfa, Texas, is a great pinpoint of the segregation of Hispanics when it comes to the school system, as well as if you look at Longview, Mansfield, and Dallas schools in San Antonio. Black and brown people in this state has had a complex history with segregation that in turn had an effect on how they interact with each other. And that's a whole different conversation of how older generations of black and brown people do not like each other because of racism implemented by white supremacy.
Where were the Asian and Hispanic kids during the segregation era? Like,
I'm gonna keep it simple. You gotta realize back in the day, there was only black and white. There was no in between. They weren't like, he's not really black, he just light-skinned it did. Nope, it did not matter. You got a white water fountain, you got a black water fountain. Anybody that wasn't white drank at that black water fountain. They don't care if you was Asian, Pacific Islander. They not worried about those titles. We got a lot of titles now, and people don't care about the titles now. So just know they didn't care about the titles back in the day. So when they did rental properties and the loans and stuff like that, it was majority whites and non-whites. So you got whites, and then you got blacks. They're not going down the whole history book list of every single name to just try to justify who's who. And nobody was trying to be called no snicker lover. So you'd be like, oh, wait, hold up. He not black, he Asian. You'd be like, shut up, you snicker lover. They not even going to worry about it. White, black, that's it. They be like, I saw a black person today. Could have been anybody. And yeah, you're going to see the majority black folks in photos because we were the majority and the target. But that's a different story.
Hispanic kids during the segregation era.
The short answer, we're basically banned from the country, and I'm going to try to see if I can give you a quick overview. Because there was the Page Act in 1875, which basically created these really high bars for Asian women to immigrate into this country, or pretty much made it impossible. Then, of course, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically banned any Chinese from America. Of course, there are some exceptions, most notably the Lo Mein loophole. Then you had the Immigration Act of 1917, which basically banned all immigration from Asia except for Japan and the Philippines, as the Philippines was an American colony at the time. And finally, you had the Johnson-Reed Act, which basically banned any immigration from Japan and set quota limits on immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act was only repealed in 1943 because the U.S. wanted to make allies with China over Japan during World War II, and many Asians were not granted citizenship unless they were born here, as directed by Birthright Citizenship and Wong Kim Ark. And yeah, Asians were not granted citizenship until about 1954 and until 1964, as we have the immigration policies that we have today. And a lot of Asian American history is just not talked about. For instance, this is Amador de Cota. He's Chinese. He fought in the army in the Civil War. There's also this man, Joseph L. Pierce, a Chinese man who fought with the U.S. Army during the Civil War, most notably Gettysburg. There was also Tong Ki Hang, who was in the U.S. Navy during the Civil War and was later stripped of his U.S. citizenship. But what a lot of high school history books don't cover is that a lot of Chinese labor actually helped reconstruct the South, where the South came up with a plan to entice Chinese laborers to help rebuild, most notably the one being the Mississippi Delta Chinese, where grocery stores, laundromats, cafes were all opening in Chinatowns in the South. And also during this time period, you had Chinatowns being burned, massacres, after massacres, and lots of discrimination, to the point where California actually wrote anti-Chinese legislation into their constitution in 1879. Remember, Asian women were pretty much banned from America, and Asian men couldn't really start families because you had interracial marriage bans by states, and you had also this federal law, the Expatriate Act of 1907, which would strip any woman of their citizenship if they were to marry an Asian man. And we have had our battles, such as Yick Wo v. Hopkins, which basically enforced the Equal Protection Clause to non-citizens. There was Wong Kim Ark, which I've done many videos on, which basically enforced birthright citizenship. There was also People v. Hall, which stated that Asians could not testify against white citizens. There was Lum v. Rice, which would be a precursor to Brown versus Board of Education, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of discrimination. There was also Henry Oyama, which would have gone to the Supreme Court before Loving v. Virginia, but Arizona actually legalized interracial marriages, so this lawsuit became null and void. I was trying to keep it short, but it didn't happen. But if you want to learn more about Asian American history, I do have a playlist here, and I try to do Asian American history every...
Respond to this video where they were loosely talking about where were Hispanics and Asian people when people were experiencing segregation through Jim Crow laws. It's a very complex answer, but somebody talked about, directly from this comment, Hernandez v. Texas. Now the comment says that it determined Hispanics were white. Not accurate. Hernandez v. Texas was taken to the Supreme Court because of a murder trial in Texas. And in this murder trial, there were an all-white jury. And this is a problem that had been happening in Texas for decades, where it was conveniently said that Hispanics were not receiving discrimination because Hispanics were white. So if there was an all, a waspy white jury in Texas in a trial against a Hispanic person, that was fair because Hispanics were white. But at the same time, there was segregation between Spanish-speaking communities and Mexican Americans not being allowed to go to the same schools as some white kids. So Hispanics had been experiencing their own form of Jim Crow type segregation. And anytime it was challenged, the convenient answer became, oh, but you guys are white, so it's not discrimination. The verdict of this murder trial was the defendant was found guilty. Hernandez was found guilty. The case was taken all the way up to the Supreme Court, not because they wanted to challenge the verdict, but this was seen as a very real opportunity to challenge Hispanic identity within the legal terms of the United States, especially in Texas, because they had been experiencing so much discrimination and then being dismissed as, but you guys are white. So when the Supreme Court took Hernandez v. Texas, they ruled that Hispanics were in fact a protected class of people. They were not just classified as white, and they were not allowed to be discriminated against, and that Texas had to ensure that a jury of a Hispanic person's peers included other Hispanic people. This also was used to help desegregate a lot of schools in California as well, because there was also some segregation.
The Asian and Hispanic kids during the segregation era, like when it was whites only and coloreds only.
Hi, political science major here. They were here. There is no gap. What you might be experiencing or might think is a gap is probably the lack of the vocalization of the stories, or the stories not being told all throughout textbooks. But for someone like me who went to college for this, it's right there. It's in the history books, and it was in some of my high school history books as well, to be fair to our government. Okay, I'm going to try to use three things to try to layer out why I think you may feel like there was a gap, or why it seems like that story is not being told or vocalized. The three things are population, location, and assimilation. I'm going to try as best as I can to use facts and not try to opine too much. All right. So the first one is population. So, and during the height of which, considered civil rights era, supported by my background here, 85% of the population was white. 11% was black, less than 4% was Latino, less than 6% was for foreign born, and I'm presuming that remaining kind of like 0.00 some percent, like in 1960, for example, I think 980,000 people identified as Asian. So that's a very small number. And I think we can conclude that with population, the larger population will have a bigger impact as far as their story being told, as far as their fight for freedom, right? So, 11% of black people going through, not all 11, but you get my point, going through Jim Crow segregation and marching, that is obviously going to make the worldwide news. There's going to be more stories written about those marches in the history book. Okay. Now, if you compare that Latino population to now, this is probably why you're seeing this discrepancy. It doesn't make sense to you. The Latino population, I believe, is going to be more than almost 22% of the U.S. population. That is a huge jump. Okay. But during the 1960s, these fights were there, right? Or even before the 1960s, right? There are a number of, Latino fight for segregation, for desegregation, right? So you see Mexican Americans going through segregation in California schools, right? There were riots. There were things like the Zoot Suit riots in the 1940s, which was also in Los Angeles, California, which leads me to my next point, which is location. So here's the thing. America's makeup, how it is now and how we know it now, is a lot different from what it was back in the 1950s and 1960s in terms of location and demographics. Okay. So in America, a large part of what most people focused on and cared about, especially is the northern part of America and the South. But a lot of places where the Latino population, remember, we've established that they were small. They were located in the southwest part of America. Okay. And the fundamental difference between the southwest part of America's segregation versus the southern segregation, where a lot of black African American people is they didn't have these laws coded. They didn't have these segregation laws coded. They didn't have these English only laws coded, unlike the Deep South, in which they had these segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, most of the time, not all the time, coded. Okay, so that's kind of the first problem. The second thing is, again, how much attention was paid to the western portion of America. Like, California now to have, a large number of electoral votes, right? It to be immensely populated. It to be a integral part to America now. The New Mexicos and whatever of the world. It didn't used to always be like that. So it was easier for what was going on in the western part of America to, either not be documented, to either not be looked at with, analyzed with deep lenses. But as you can see here, for context, there are documented, lawsuits of Mexican American parents suing Orange County, California school districts on behalf of their children and 5,000 other children of Mexican and Latin descent, arguing that the segregation, even though it was not coded in the law, was violating their constitutional rights. So these things existed. It was there. It happened. Okay. So like for context, if you go to learningforjustice.org, you'll see some of, just documented history of the, fight by Mexican, Hispanic population from the 60s on, things like the Latino high school walkouts, and you'll see it. It's there. You can even go back as early as the 1910s and see, what the Hispanic population, was doing. And then there are also stuff about the Asian population, but again, it was different. When we talk about the Chinese with the gold rush, that's a little more complex. And I just want to keep this as simple as possible, right? It's there. Like, it's right there. There was a Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, that pursued protection of civil rights of Mexican Americans. Like it's there. Okay. That's just my main point. Now, my final point is more of kind of an opinion, conclusion / inference that I've drawn, and which is the concept of assimilation. I think that, unlike Black Americans, I think that there is an easier path to assimilation for Hispanic Americans, and sometimes Asian Americans in the United States, but particularly with Hispanic Americans, to be able to assimilate into whiteness, right? And I think that because of that, year over year assimilation, even though some people may still identify as Hispanic, I think that there is less incentive to, regurgitate and or keep putting the story of America's treatment of their forefathers to the forefront. This part is mostly opinion. And I think that unlike, a lot of African American brothers and sisters who have, grandparents and great grandparents telling them the stories of what they went through in the Deep South, and they are still seeing kind of, I guess, the consequences of that, and they're still seeing some of that similar treatment in America today. It's harder for Black people to assimilate with whiteness, unless, again, you're biracial and then you marry a white person, and that type of conversation, which is for another day. It's, I think, much easier for an Hispanic American who is not Afro, Latino, to assimilate. And the easier you can assimilate, the easier you are to probably forgive your government, to not, to let bygones be bygones. So I hope I explained this well. I do vividly remembering my high school history books having some of these stories. I don't think it was as detailed as stuff that I learned in college, but if you most definitely just type in Latino segregation era, a lot of the stuff will pop up.
Where were the Asian and Hispanic kids during the segregation era? Like when.
So when we talk about, where were these people at? I think one, we need to specify the question a little bit more. Which group of Hispanics, which groups of Asians? We also need to look for which region in particular we're trying to find them, and the time frame. We have to keep that in mind. So with regard to Asian Americans, I think we need to remember that most Asian Americans were not in the United States prior to the Civil Rights Movement. Remember, the Civil Rights Movement gave birth to a lot of immigration reform that allowed a bunch of other ethnic groups and minorities to start to migrate to the United States or immigrate to the United States. That's the first thing. And that's not to say that there weren't Asian Americans in the United States. They just weren't in large numbers, much less in places like the Jim Crow South. Most Asian Americans that were living in the U.S. at that time were living in coastal areas like LA, San Francisco, Oakland, or even out in New York on the East Coast, right? But most of them were not in the Deep South. They just weren't. Now, again, there are some outliers. For example, in New Orleans, there was a pretty decent influx of Vietnamese people, during the Vietnam War. However, they were further out in areas like Michoud, New Orleans East, right, or like further out in the bayou. They weren't centrally located. Like, they wasn't in Mid-City. They wasn't in Treme. They wasn't in the Seventh Ward. They wasn't uptown. They wasn't in the Third Ward, nothing like that, Jeremy. Like, they was further out. They wasn't in all the areas that were more, like, Black concentrated, if that makes any sense. Now, when we talk about Hispanic Americans, we got to remember that's a lot of different groups. You heard me? So let's start with Mexican Americans first. Most Mexican Americans at that time were living in what we now know as the Southwest United States. So going pretty much everywhere from like Central and West Texas all the way out to New Mexico, Arizona, California, in that region, right? They were not in the Deep South, places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, the areas that were most impacted by Jim Crow and segregation. They were not in those areas in large numbers, right? Now, later on, you did start to see a lot of Mexican Americans migrating to Chicago, but that was coincidentally around the same time that black people were going to Chicago. So that's that. Again, most Mexicans were not in the southeast or the deep south of the United States. They just weren't. And then in regards to Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and a few other groups that might have come from like the Caribbean, for example, they didn't really show up until the 1980s when you start to see a lot of immigration reform during the Reagan administration, which is ironic that he was the one that was doing that because that man was the devil, to call a speed a speed. So I hope this helps anybody that might have.
Where were the Asian and Hispanic kids during the segregation era?
Chinese, no, no, no. That's how some people felt in the United States during the Jim Crow era, which spanned nearly 90 years from 1877 until the mid-60s. During that time in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by the U.S. government. This banned Chinese and other people from immigrating to the U.S. Propaganda from white America portrayed Chinese and Asians as the enemy. They were dangerous. The Immigration Act of 1917 essentially expanded the Chinese Exclusion Act to include the Middle East and other places in Southeast Asia. Going back 150 years, the United States had a problem with people coming from China and many locations in Asia, and because of that, their population in the U.S. was fairly low through the 1950s. Jim Crow laws were location dependent and generally they were exclusive to the south of the U.S. And Asians weren't immune to the segregation that African Americans dealt with themselves. There's this headline that says, "Young Chinese girl can't attend Gresham. Aliens not admitted under the law. Pupils must be naturalized and of Caucasian race according to Act creating Bibb schools." Bibb County is in Alabama. In the 1927 Supreme Court case, Lum versus Rice, the Supreme Court essentially said it was okay to discriminate and segregate Chinese children from the white population. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed, which actually allowed, finally, some immigrants from Eastern Europe and Asia to enter the country, but that was limited to 100 visas per country. The Asian country with the highest allotted number of visas was Japan at 185 per year. It wasn't until the 1960s that Asians were allowed to immigrate to the U.S. in much larger numbers. This illustration from over a century ago shows the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American, holding the Italian in one hand and the person from China in the other, showing their dominance and control over these foreigners. The Chinese were massacred, in this case, Wyoming. There was another Chinese massacre in Lynching in Los Angeles as well, in addition to the other events that happened through the year. This image and information from the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles says because Italian Americans and African Americans lived in the same neighborhoods and worked together, Italians were considered enemies of Jim Crow laws. Indeed, Italian immigrants were often unconscious or indifferent towards America's racial hierarchy. In 1899, 2 Italian shopkeepers and 3 customers, also Italian, were lynched in Tallulah, Louisiana, for refusing to wait on Caucasians before African American customers. Because of that lynching, there was even a song that came out of it in Italian called I Cinque Poveri Italiani, which means the 5 poor Italians. The largest lynching of Italians in the U.S. took the lives of 11 in New Orleans in 1891. Because many Italian immigrants had come from the south of Italy, generally their complexions were a bit darker because of their DNA having mixed throughout the Mediterranean, including North African, even Sub-Saharan African, in the DNA of many Sicilians. The text here says, because of their darker complexions, Italians were not considered white. This was particularly dangerous in the American South, where Italians were the second most common targets of lynching, and in some areas were semi-segregated. KKK, they weren't fans of Italians either. This image depicting a couple of Italians in a tree labeled Rome being chopped down by a Klansman. The Italian shoe shiner is depicted to look more African American because the idea in American society at the time was the Italians were similar, if not a lower class of people than African Americans. And that hierarchy is actually shown in the wages that were paid for white workers, African American workers, and Italians, where Italians were getting the lowest wages according to this public notice of daily wages for workers on New York City's Croton Reservoir in 1895. No Italians allowed to work on this project in 1888, a paving project on East Washington Street. The Italian-American Museum of Los Angeles says here that in 1914, the Colorado National Guard and Colorado Fuel and Iron Company guards attacked striking coal miners and their families, the majority of whom were Italian and Mexican, in Ludlow, Colorado. 24 people, including miners, wives, and children, were killed. The mine's owners, John D. Rockefeller Jr., was widely criticized for the incident, which became a watershed moment in American labor relations. During World War II, Italians, Germans, and Japanese were required to register as enemy nationalities with the U.S. government and carry that special ID around with them at all times. Italian, Japanese, and German folks not only had to register, but they were also restricted. In some areas, there were curfews, and some places that were simply off limits to those who were of those nationalities. Forget about speaking Italian, Japanese, or German in public. The final blow to Italians, Germans, and Japanese in America was 120,000 of them being shipped off to internment camps, many of whom were actually American citizens. Now, it was only a small number of Italians who ended up in these internment camps, with the majority of the 120,000 being those of Japanese and Japanese ancestry. We move into the civil rights movement that started in the 1950s. The population of Asian Americans in the U.S. in 1950 was a little over 300,000, which is 0.2% of the U.S. population at the time. The Italian population was about 4 million, and that constituted about 2% of the U.S. population in 1950, and the African American population at that time was 15 million, so about 10% of the population. And while Asians and Italians weren't a large part of the African American civil rights movement that led through the 50s and 60s, enter the late 60s and 70s, and that's when the Asian community and also the Italian community in the U.S. started to organize for their own rights. By that time, the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s had already advanced and helped the Asian community, and of course the Italian community had a bit different.
Hispanic kids during the segregation era.
Chinese, no, no, no. Propaganda from white America portrayed Chinese and Asians as the enemy. They were dangerous. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by the U.S. government. This banned Chinese and other people from immigrating to the U.S. Asians weren't immune to the segregation that African Americans dealt with themselves. A young Chinese girl can't attend Gresham. Aliens not admitted under the law. Pupils must be naturalized and of Caucasian race. In the 1927 Supreme Court case, Lum versus Rice, the Supreme Court essentially said it was okay to discriminate and segregate Chinese children from the white population. The Chinese were massacred, in this case, Wyoming. There was another Chinese massacre in Lynching in Los Angeles. In 1899, 2 Italian shopkeepers and 3 customers, also Italian, were lynched in Tallulah, Louisiana, for refusing to wait on Caucasians before African-American customers. Because of that lynching, there was even a song that came out of it in Italian. The largest lynching of Italians in the U.S. took the lives of 11 in New Orleans in 1891. Because of their darker complexions, Italians were not considered white. This was particularly dangerous in the American South, where Italians were the second most common targets of lynching, and in some areas were semi-segregated. KKK, they weren't fans of Italians either. The Italians were similar, if not a lower class of people than African Americans. And that hierarchy is actually shown in the wages that were paid for white workers, African American workers, and Italians, where Italians were getting the lowest wages, according to this public notice of daily wages. Italians allowed to work on this project. During World War II, Italians, Germans, and Japanese were required to register as enemy nationalities with the U.S. government and carry that special ID around with them at all times. 120,000 of them being shipped off to internment camps, many of whom were actually American citizens.
My non-Black Latinos are gonna hate me for saying this, but y'all are the reason that we cannot become truly unified with Black people. Y'all are the reason that black people are on the fence about non-black Latinos. It's because y'all are very anti-black and won't even do the bare minimum of just stop saying the N-word. Like, y'all won't even stop saying that word. And y'all don't realize that even though a lot of non-black Latinos see themselves as like socially higher up than black people and black Latinos, that's not how white people see us, y'all. That is not how they see us. It doesn't matter what you are, you're just not white. And a lot of y'all think that perpetuating this anti-blackness and racism is gonna knock you a couple points higher and it's gonna make you all kumbaya with the white people. No, they don't see y'all as humans.
You know what's crazy to me, bro, is when they had the BLM protest, everybody was popping out. Every celebrity, YG, the Ball brothers, everybody was popping out. Where's that now? Where are the celebrities now? Where are they protesting now? Where are the teams now? Why is nobody speaking up? Even Kendrick Lamar made a song. Lil Baby made a song. But where's everybody now?
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. Where's J-Lo? Where's Bad Bunny? Where's Maluma? Where's Shakira? Talk to your own people. Because J-Lo was just up on the pulpit at the inauguration doing this.
Y justicia para todos. Let's get
No matter what happens in this country, everyone under that POC umbrella always finds a way to put the focus back on black people. Obviously, we understand what's going on right now with the ICE raids that are going on in America and Los Angeles, to be specific. But there have been a lot of Latino people coming online asking about black celebrities and black people showing up and comparing this event to BLM. Now, don't get me wrong. We were home during the pandemic. People had no jobs. People weren't in the office. And yes, black people, black celebrities, black businessmen showed up for black people. Corporations and teams that had black people on them showed up for their black constituents and their black workers. As it currently stands as demographic, there are more Latinos in America than there are black people. And half of that population voted for what's going on right now. Speak to your own population. Stand up for yourself with each other. Talk internally about how you're so disjointed between the Central and South Americans and the Caribbean people in the East Coast. Talk to each other. Why are you looking for black people to put you guys on a pedestal and go fight for you when this is also your fight, primarily your fight? Black Lives Matter was our fight, but we speak up for ourselves. We also speak up for everyone, and we did it the most with our vote. And even though black people are saying this is not our fight, we're sitting this out, we're doing all these things like resting, there are several ways black people are showing up by not supporting Starbucks, by not supporting Target, by not supporting any company that put out D&I, by boycotting, by using our voice like I do. There's so many ways that black people still will always show up for ourselves in this country. And when we show up for ourselves, guess who benefits? Everyone else. Reach out to your fellow Asians. Reach out to your Middle Eastern Arab people. Reach out to the large Russian population that's in LA. The Armenians, the Persians. There's so many immigrant groups that live in this city, but you want to single out black people. Can't win them all. Ciao.
What if Black, Latino, and Asian communities stopped waiting to be included and started building together? Not as a slogan, not as a hashtag, but as an economic strategy. Every major shift in power in this country has followed the same rule. Whoever controls production or distribution and capital controls their future. And right now, our communities produce the labor, the culture, and the demand, but other people capture the value. That isn't an accident. That's a design flaw that we can change. The truth is, individually, our communities are told we're too small, we're too divided, or too risky to invest in. Together, that argument collapses. Combined, Black, Latino, and Asian communities represent tens of trillions in lifetime spending power, a dominant share of small business creation, the backbone of logistics, healthcare, construction, food, tech, and service labor, the future demographic majority of this country. Yet we still operate like isolated islands, competing for scraps, fighting over narratives, and shopping from corporations that don't even reinvest in our neighborhoods. That isn't diversity. That's fragmentation. When communities intentionally do business with each other, money stops leaking out as fast, jobs stabilize, businesses survive long enough to grow, and families build assets instead of just income. More importantly, power becomes structural instead of symbolic. You got city leaders that's going to listen when you control the contracts. Banks, they negotiate when you move capital together. Media shifts tone when you are economically unavoidable. Politicians stop playing games when jobs and tax bases depend on you. This isn't about exclusion, it's about self-respect and self-preservation. They don't want to have this conversation because history shows that when marginalized groups cooperate economically, the rules suddenly change. New fears get manufactured, right? Communities get pitted against each other. Culture wars replace policy discussions. Division is cheaper than justice. Fragmentation is easier than reform. If we stay divided, nothing has to change. This isn't anti-anyone, it's pro-community. No one questions corporations when they buy from their own networks. No one asks why wealthy families invest together. No one shames other groups for protecting their economic interests. Only us. And that shame has a purpose. The question isn't, is it allowed? The question is, how long can we afford not to? Because every year that we delay, more businesses get closed, more wealth exits our communities, more young people inherit struggle instead of opportunity. Coordination doesn't require perfection. It requires commitment, discipline, and a trust built through action. If Black, Latino, and Asian communities chose cooperation over competition, not in theory, but in contracts, hiring, and capital, the economic map of this country would change faster than most people are ready for. That's why the idea feels threatening, and that's how you know it matters. This isn't about hate. This is about building something strong enough that hate stops working.
I don't have much to add to this H Mart Gate drama except for this. Black people staying in our business, I like it. Because regardless of what your position is on the whole H Mart, blah, 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 at least you guys are caring. Because at the end of the day, this whole H Mart scandal is about whether or not Asians should be welcoming to white people and if assimilation or getting the goodwill from white people is the goal. You know who's been staying giving us that goodwill though, via drama and gossip? The Black community. And it's making me think about my immigrant mom, who was an engineer for 30 years, worked with a ton of racist people. But she said that one person who just seemed to really understand her was the only Black person on the team. And she was like, there's just something that like we just get about each other. And also I think she thinks I'm cute. And that has never left me. I always think about that. So thank you for having our backs, Black community. May we return the favor.
Anyways, welcome back and let's dive into this. So during the era of racial segregation in the United States, roughly late 1800s to 1960s, Asian Americans were present in the country, but their experience were somewhat different from Black and white segregation system that exists especially in the South. Now, Asian community face their own form of discrimination, exclusion, laws, and segregation, mainly in the Western states. Asian communities were and what they experienced. Now, the first thing they experienced was many Asian community lived in the Western United States, where mostly Asian immigrants live in places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Hawaii, okay, where large community formed in neighborhood often called Chinatown, Japantown, and Filipinos districts. Now, the second thing is Asian immigrants faced their own segregation, where Asian Americans were often not allowed to live in certain neighborhoods, attend certain schools, or marry white Americans because of discriminatory laws. One example is the court case Gon Lum v. Rice, where a Chinese American girl was forced to attend a segregated school for Black students instead of white school. Now we have the Asian immigration was heavily restricted, where the US passes laws that limited Asian immigrants such as Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese laborers from entering the country for decades. This meant Asian populations in the US were relatively small compared to other groups. 4. Where many Asians work in specific industries. Asian American often works in labor sectors such as the railroad construction, the farming and agriculture, the fishing, the domestic work, the small business like laundries and restaurants, where these industries help to build parts of the American economy. Now let's talk about the Japanese American who face the interment during the World War II. Now, during the World War II, the US government forced about 120,000 Japanese American into internment camp after the attack on Pearl Harbor, where many of them were US citizens, including children. We have the cities where the Asian children attend segregated or separate schools, where in some areas, Asian children attend separate schools or classrooms, especially in California and other Western states. However, the segregation system affecting Asian Americans were often less formalized than the Jim Crow system imposed on Black Americans in the South. Let's talk where the Asian community built their own institutions. So because of discrimination, Asian Americans created their own schools, their own churches and temples, their own businesses, their own cultural organization, and this community helped protect their culture and support each other. In many places, Asians were treated as neither fully accepted or white, nor placed in the same category as Black Americans. This social status varies depending on location and time period. Asian Americans participated in the civil rights effort and legal battle that challenged discriminatory laws. Their struggles helped change immigration policy and civil rights protection. A major turning point came with Immigration and Nationalities Act of the 1965, which removed racial quotas and allowed more immigration from Asian countries. After this, Asian American population increased significantly across the United States. Note, Asian community were present in America during segregation, mostly in the West. They faced discrimination, immigration restrictions, and sometimes segregation, but their experience from the strict Jim Crow system were totally different from the ones that were imposed on Black Americans. And this is why I keep saying it, like, Black Americans paved way for every single race. Honestly, Black Americans paved way for every single race in the US right now. And that's why I keep saying, if you don't have anybody to respect, why not at least respect people that have literally paved way for you to be in America? Do you get? Because in as much as Asian people were facing a little bit of segregation, it was also stated, and if you check from what I have actually read out of my research, it was still stated that the ones that were imposed on Black Americans during the Jim Crow law was worse, was way higher. Do you get? And in relating it to today's business, I feel like one of the people that have literally supposed to respect and cooperate with Black Americans should be Asian community. But you know, they still have this mentality of they have proximity to whiteness, and at the same time they think they are white, and at the same time they think that Black Americans literally do not have anything to offer them as Asians. I don't know if you guys are getting the point where I am coming from, but anyways, let me know what you think about all of this in the comment section, and credits belong to the original creators of every single clips and stitches we have in at this episode. I want to say a very big thank you to every single one of you liking, commenting, sharing, dropping super thanks, and also joining my membership. I do not take you guys for granted. You guys are absolutely the best. And thank you so much for staying stick and hooked with me to the end of this video. And yes guys, with that being said, with no further ado, I do like I always say in my videos, I'm going to be saying bye, and I'll see you guys in my next one. For now, bye guys. I love you guys. Mwah.